The vulture should have risen when Ethan Mercer rode beneath it. It didn't. It dropped toward the same split in the canyon again and again, as if the desert were pointing at something it wanted buried. Ethan followed. What he found beneath the red cliffs was an Apache warrior pinned under a slab of stone, and less than 1 cup of water left in Ethan's canteen. 1 man could ride away and live. 2 men could try to leave together and die before sunset. Ethan dismounted. The young warrior lay in a dry wash where a shelf of rock had broken loose during the night. 1 leg disappeared beneath the slab. His face was gray beneath the dust. His lips had split open from thirst. A turquoise pendant rested against his throat, dark with sweat. Ethan touched 2 fingers to the man's neck. A pulse answered, weak, but there. Ethan tipped 3 drops of water onto the warrior's tongue. Then he looked at the stone. It weighed more than a horse, maybe 2. He could not lift it. He could not dig through the packed earth before the heat finished them both. But 20 yards up the wash, a lightning-struck juniper had fallen across the rocks. Ethan dragged the trunk down the slope, wedged one end beneath the slab, and stacked 2 flat stones under it for a pivot. He wrapped the reins around the other end, tied them to his saddle horn, and led his mare forward. The rope tightened, the juniper bent. The slab moved half an inch, then slammed back down. The warrior groaned. "Easy," Ethan whispered. I know. He reset the stones. This time he dug the pivot deeper and poured a mouthful of his own water into the dust beneath it, turning the loose sand into mud so the base would not slide. That left almost nothing in the canteen. He slapped the mare's flank. The rope snapped tight. The juniper screamed against the stone, and the slab rose just high enough. Ethan dropped to his knees, seized the warrior beneath the arms, and pulled. The man's trapped leg came free with a sickening scrape. Then the lever broke. The stone crashed into the place where his body had been. For several seconds neither man moved. Ethan could hear only the vulture circling above them. The leg was badly crushed, but the skin had not broken. That was the one mercy the desert had given them. Ethan cut 2 straight ribs from a dead cactus skeleton, patted them with strips from his shirt, and bound the leg from ankle to thigh. Then he lifted the warrior across the saddle. The young man weighed less than he should have. 2 hours separated them from Ethan's line shack. The canteen held perhaps 10 ounces. Ethan gave 8 of them away. By the time the shack appeared through the heat, his own tongue had swollen against his teeth. Inside, he laid the warrior on the cot and worked until darkness covered the windows. He cooled the fever with wet cloth. He boiled willow bark for pain. He packed the bruised leg with creosote leaves and clean clay, the way an old Mexican vaquero had once taught him. Every few minutes, Ethan lifted the man's head and gave him another swallow from the well bucket. The warrior never fully woke. Near midnight, Ethan noticed a leather band around his wrist. Burned into it was a mark he had seen once at a trading post, a sign belonging to the family of the headman the traders called Black Mesa. Ethan sat back. He had not dragged a nameless scout from the canyon. He had brought home the son of the most powerful Apache headman west of the Rio Grande. That knowledge did not make Ethan regret saving him. It only told him what would be coming. At dawn, the ground began to tremble. Ethan opened his eyes to a red cloud rolling across the eastern plain. Not weather, riders. They came in lines so wide the desert seemed to move with them. More than 300 Apache horsemen spread around the shack in a silent ring. Bows were strung. Rifles rested across saddles. No one shouted. That silence was worse than a war cry. At the front sat a broad-shouldered man on a dark bay horse. His hair was tied back with red cloth. He wore no feathered war bonnet, no decoration meant for a white man's imagination, only a worn buckskin shirt, a wool blanket folded behind his saddle, and the calm face of someone who had buried too many people to fear one more grave. The traders called him Black Mesa. He raised one hand. Every weapon in the circle became still. Ethan stepped outside without his rifle. "My son," Black Mesa said in careful English. "Alive," Ethan answered. Inside, 4 warriors moved past him. A moment later, one called from the doorway. The headman dismounted. Inside the shack, the young warrior stirred as his father knelt beside the cot. His eyes opened for the first time. He spoke one word, "Father." The headman's face changed. Not much, but enough. He touched the splint, smelled the poultice, then looked at the bucket of clear water beside the bed. "You used your water on him." "Yes." "How much?" "Enough." Black Mesa's eyes moved to Ethan's cracked lips. "You had little." "So did he." The headman stood. "White soldiers killed my brother while he carried a flag. Miners poisoned a stream my people used. Traders sold flour mixed with chalk. Why did you help my son? Ethan met his gaze, because the rock did not ask which side he was on. For a long moment Black Mesa said nothing. Then the warrior on the cot whispered to him. His name, Ethan learned, was Nalan. The headman listened, then translated. He says you gave him water before you drank. Ethan nodded. Black Mesa walked to the doorway and looked across the empty country. Our camp is 3 days north, he said. The springs there are mud. Children scrape wet sand with their hands. Horses fall before sunrise. Ethan's eyes shifted toward the southern ridge. That small movement was enough. The headman saw it. You know water. It was not a question. Ethan had lived alone in that desert for 6 years. He knew where storm pools formed, where roots stayed green after drought, where birds flew at dusk. And he knew one place no map showed. 2 winters earlier, a flash flood had opened a crack in a wall of black volcanic rock. Behind it, Ethan had found a narrow passage descending into the earth. At the bottom lay a spring-fed basin wider than a church, cold and clear even in August, he had told no one. A hidden spring was not merely water. In that country it was life, power, and the right to remain. Ethan had guarded it because the first rumor would bring cattlemen, miners, speculators, and men with papers claiming they owned what they had never seen. Now more than 300 riders stood outside his shack. Beyond them were families he could not see, children digging for mud. Ethan looked at Nalan, then at his father. There is water south of here, he said, a great deal of it. Black Mesa's expression hardened. Why tell me? Because I just spent my last water proving I did not want your son to die. The headman studied him. Show me. They left before the sun climbed high. Black Mesa took 30 riders. Ethan led them through basalt country where the land looked burned from within. They passed a broken column of rock shaped like a bent finger, then 3 pale mesquite trees growing from one root. At noon, Ethan stopped beside a wall no different from 100 others. He pushed through a curtain of thorn and disappeared into a crack barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. The riders followed one by one. Inside, the air cooled. The passage twisted downward for 40 paces, then opened so suddenly several men stopped in disbelief. A pool filled the chamber. Not a puddle, not a seep, a dark, clear basin nearly 60 yards across, fed by water spilling from a shelf of stone. In the torchlight, the surface looked like polished glass. Black Mesa knelt and drank. Then he cupped water in both hands and held it as though it were something alive. It does not stop, he asked. I watched it through 2 dry summers, Ethan said. It fell by the width of my hand. No more. One of the older warriors laughed once, a broken sound that turned into a sob. Another pressed his forehead to the wet stone. Black Mesa remained kneeling. What do you ask for this? Nothing. No man gives away water for nothing. Ethan looked around the cavern. I lived alone because I thought solitude kept a man clean of other people's wars. It doesn't. It only keeps him from seeing who pays for them. The headman rose. You found this water. I found the door. The water was here before either of us. Black Mesa stepped close enough that Ethan could see the fine dust in the lines around his eyes. If my people come, others will learn. I know. You may lose it. I know. You may lose more than water. Ethan thought of soldiers, cattle companies, survey stakes, men who could turn a spring into a boundary and a boundary into a grave. I know. The headman placed one hand over Ethan's heart. Then the gift is not the spring, he said. The gift is the danger you accept with it. Behind him, 30 spear shafts struck the stone floor once. The sound rolled through the cavern like thunder. By dusk the next day, the first families arrived. There were not 700 warriors. There were old people, mothers, infants, boys leading tired ponies, women carrying baskets, men supporting the sick. The riders Ethan had feared were only the hard shell around a people exhausted by drought. Nalan was carried in a travois beside his father. When he saw the spring, he smiled at Ethan. You pulled me from one stone, he said in slow English. Now you pull all of us from another. The band made camp in a sheltered valley half a mile from the cavern. They widened the entrance carefully, never enough to expose it from the plain. Ethan helped cut wooden troughs for the horses and line a narrow channel with clay so water could be carried outside without muddying the basin. For 12 days the valley sounded like work. Axes, children grinding stones, horses drinking. At night, small fires glowed beneath the cottonwoods that had somehow survived below the ridge. Nalan's fever broke. His leg remained swollen, but the bones held straight beneath the splint. He spent each afternoon outside Ethan's shelter, teaching him words and laughing at his mistakes. Ethan taught him card tricks. Nalan cheated at all of them. On the 21st night, Black Mesa called the people together. He spoke in his own language for several minutes. Ethan understood only his name and the word for water. Then Nayland translated. My father says a man is not known by the flag behind him. He is known by what he protects when no one can reward him. Black Mesa held out a small cup carved from mesquite. It had been filled from the spring. He drank, then handed it to Ethan. Ethan drank. Nayland drank last. No knives cut their palms. No theatrical oath was needed. In a land where a cup of water could decide who lived until morning, sharing one was enough. For the first time in 6 years, Ethan slept among other people and did not keep one hand on his rifle. 3 months passed. The valley changed. Grass returned along the clay channel. Thin cattle gained weight. Children who had arrived hollow-eyed began racing along the ridge at sunset. Nayland walked again, first with 2 sticks, then 1, then none. Ethan spent more nights in the valley than at his shack. The people called him by a name Nayland translated as the man who opens stone. Ethan protested. I used a tree, Nayland grinned. That name is too long. The peace might have lasted longer if water could stay invisible. But water always leaves signs. Green cottonwood leaves in a dead valley. Horse tracks where no horses should survive. Smoke rising 3 mornings in a row. The first men to notice were not soldiers. They were surveyors working for a stage company that wanted a new route west. They found the outer troughs, followed the channel, and marked the valley with white stakes. Ethan pulled every stake out before sunset. 2 weeks later, the army arrived. 17 cavalrymen rode into the valley under a young lieutenant named Warren Pike. Behind them came 2 surveyors, a mule wagon, and a civilian agent carrying a leather case full of papers. Pike read from one of them without looking at Black Mesa. By territorial authority, this band is ordered to move to the designated agency within 10 days. The spring and surrounding land are reserved for military and transport use. Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest. They had not come because the band had attacked anyone. They had come because someone had discovered the water. Black Mesa stood with Nayland and nearly 200 armed men behind him. No, he said. Lieutenant Pike folded the paper. That was not a request. Nayland stepped forward. We have harmed no settlement. You are off the reservation. This was our country before your reservation. The civilian agent smiled as if the answer bored him. Pike's eyes moved to Ethan. We know who you are, Mercer, former civilian scout. Dismissed after striking an officer, I resigned. After striking an officer, he ordered a family out of a burning shelter. The lieutenant's jaw tightened. You are under arrest for aiding hostiles and obstructing a federal survey. 2 soldiers dismounted. Nayland moved between them and Ethan. Every bow behind him rose. Every cavalry carbine came off its sling. The valley became perfectly still. This was the moment the desert had been waiting for. 1 nervous finger, 1 frightened horse. 1 word spoken too sharply, and the spring would fill with blood. Ethan looked at Nayland. Move! No! You owe me nothing. I owe you my life. Then use it by staying alive. Nayland did not move. Black Mesa spoke 1 sentence. The bows lowered, not far, but enough. He had chosen restraint in front of men who would call restraint weakness. Lieutenant Pike saw it, so did the soldiers. Ethan raised his hands. I will go with you, he said, but first you will see what you are taking. The civilian agent scoffed. We have seen the spring. No, you have seen a trough. Ethan led Pike, the agent, Black Mesa, and 6 soldiers into the cavern. Torches lit the black walls. Water poured steadily over stone. The agent's face changed the instant he saw the basin. Not wonder, calculation. Enough for a relay station, he whispered. Perhaps a settlement. Black Mesa heard him. So that is why your paper came. Pike looked uncomfortable. The route is considered strategically necessary. Ethan walked to the edge of the pool. Ask him how many wagons the company plans to bring. The agent said nothing. Ask him how many cattle, Ethan continued. How many horses? How many wells they will blast through the rock when this basin drops. Ask him how long before the water turns foul. Pike frowned. You cannot know that. I kept a record. From a dry shelf above the entrance, Ethan pulled a small oilskin notebook. For 2 years he had marked the waterline each month, along with rainfall, animal tracks, and the spring's recovery after use. He opened it. In the hottest month, the basin falls when more than 90 horses drink daily. It rises again if the channel is closed at night. This spring can support people who manage it. It cannot support a stage depot, a cavalry post, and every settler a company advertisement sends here. The agent reached for the notebook. Ethan closed it. You do not want water. You want the story that there is no limit. The man's face hardened. Pike stared across the basin. For the first time, the lieutenant was not looking at an Apache camp or a government order. He was looking at arithmetic, at consequence, at a place that could be destroyed by the very men claiming they intended to improve it. But orders were still orders. "We return to the valley," he said. Outside, the sun had dropped behind the ridge. Then a shot cracked from the north. Every person in the valley turned. A second shot followed, not from the cavalry. From beyond the ridge. One of Black Mesa's scouts rode in fast, pointing back toward the plain. Behind him came a wagon leaning hard to one side. Its rear wheel had split. 2 men walked beside it, waving a white cloth. Inside were 5 settlers, a woman, an old man, and 3 children. Their water barrel had burst 20 miles east. The youngest child was no longer conscious. The timing was so cruel it felt arranged. The civilian agent whispered, "Do not let them into the camp." Black Mesa looked at him. "Why? They may be bait." "They are thirsty," Ethan said. The agent turned on him. "You do not know who they are." Black Mesa's gaze moved to the wagon, then to Ethan, then to the spring. For one heartbeat, Ethan understood the choice before him. The headman could refuse. No soldier in that valley had the right to judge him. His people had been driven from water, deceived at water, shot beside water. The strangers in that wagon belonged to the same world that now came carrying papers to take this spring away. Black Mesa raised his hand. His warriors opened the line. "Bring them in." Women from the camp ran first. They lifted the unconscious child into shade. Nalin carried water. An elderly healer cooled the girl's neck and wrists while Ethan checked her breathing. Lieutenant Pike stood frozen as the people he had come to remove used their hidden spring to save settlers they had never met. The little girl coughed, then cried. Her mother collapsed over her, sobbing. Black Mesa did not watch for thanks. He turned to Pike. "This water is not hidden from the thirsty," he said, "only from the greedy." The lieutenant looked at the civilian agent, then at the white survey stakes stacked beside Ethan's shelter. Finally, he took the removal order from his pocket and folded it once. "I cannot cancel this," he said quietly, "but I can report that the spring cannot support the proposed station, that the band rendered aid to civilians, and that forced removal would risk unnecessary loss of life." The agent stepped toward him. "You will destroy your career." Pike looked at the child drinking from Nalin's cup. Then it was not much of a career. He ordered his men to repair the wagon wheel. At sunrise, the cavalry left with the settlers. Ethan went with them in irons. Nalin tried to follow, but Black Mesa stopped him. "Why?" Nalin demanded. The headman watched the soldiers disappear. "Because your brother asked you to live." Ethan spent 43 days in a stockade. The civilian agent accused him of theft, obstruction, and conspiracy. The stage company demanded the spring survey. Lieutenant Pike submitted his report, Ethan's water records, and statements from all 5 settlers. The mother of the rescued child sent a letter to a newspaper in Santa Fe. The story spread, not as a tale of savages threatening soldiers, as a tale of an Apache band giving water to a dying white child, while government men stood ready to take the spring for profit. Public pressure did not make the government just. It did something smaller, and for that valley, enough. The stage route was moved 12 miles north. The military suspended the removal order while officials argued over jurisdiction. No treaty was restored. No stolen land returned. The band knew paper could change again, but winter came before another column of soldiers did. When Ethan finally rode back, Nalin waited at the mouth of the valley. His healed leg was straight. He carried the same mesquite cup used on the night Ethan was accepted. Without a word, he filled it from the trough and handed it over. Ethan drank. Then he noticed a second cup in Nalin's other hand. "For whom?" Ethan asked. Nalin pointed behind him. Lieutenant Pike stood beside the repaired stage wagon, out of uniform now, helping unload sacks of corn and flour. The rescued girl's family had returned with supplies. So had 2 Mexican ranchers, a blacksmith, and a widow from a nearby settlement whose well had failed. Not allies in every matter, not one people, not healed of history, just thirsty human beings standing near the same water. Black Mesa came to Ethan's side. "You opened stone again," he said. Ethan shook his head. "No, this time you did." The headman looked across the valley as Nalin handed Pike the second cup. For years afterward, travelers who entered that country heard rumors of a hidden spring guarded by Apache riders and a white man who had chosen the wrong side according to everyone except his own conscience. The rumors missed the truth. The spring was not guarded from enemies. It was guarded from anyone who believed water belonged only to the powerful. In a country that kept drawing lines between men, the spring kept crossing everyone.